Ethiopia's Prime Minister Abiy Ahmed Ali stands out as one of the youngest leaders in East Africa and the entire African continent. He rose to power at the age of 42 following the resignation of his predecessor, Prime Minister Hailemarian Desalegn, and he quickly exemplified himself as a peacemaker and a collaborative international leader. For example, Abiy Ahmed's rapprochement with Eritrea earned him the Nobel Peace Prize in 2019, but his aura then seriously faded when he sent the Ethiopian Federal Army to quell the rebellious authorities of the northern region of Tigray. The war in Tigray, which lasted from November 2020 to November 2022, claimed several 100,000 lives. Ever since then, Abiy Ahmed's journey from darling of the international community to condemnation has been very swift. In this episode of African Biographics, we look at the rise of Ethiopia's Abiy Ahmed and how he moved from being a Nobel laureate to a global pariah. The man known as Abiy Ahmed was born on August 15, 1976, a mere 2 years after the overthrow of the Ethiopian monarchy and the seizure of power by the Derg military regime. His childhood name was Abiot, which translates to revolution, and the name was sometimes given to children in the aftermath of the Ethiopian revolution in the mid-1970s. Abiy's father, Ahmed Ali, is an Oromo Muslim and an important and respected member of the Beshasha community. His mother, Tezeta, an ethnic Amara, was born in Oromia's Burayu, an area located in the once hotly contested Addis Ababa Special Zone. Within this context, Abiy was exposed to two of Ethiopia's major religions at a very young age with a Muslim father and a Christian mother. According to his father, Abiy enjoyed studying religious books such as the Quran and, unlike others his age, was mainly focused on reading and learning new things by keeping the company of those older than him. Growing up, the young Abiy spoke both Afan Oromo and Amharic. Unfortunately, Abiy's teenage years were filled with turmoil as Ethiopia was at war and the majority of the people were discontent and looking for a way out. In 1974, a military faction called the Derg seized power, overthrowing the Emperor Haile Selassie. The Derg's leader, Colonel Mengistu Hailemariam, presided over a murderous purge known as the Red Terror. Years down the line, in the late 80s and early 90s, the Derg regime was being fought tooth and nail by the Ethiopian People's Revolutionary Democratic Front, the EPRDF, which had member groups such as the Oromo Liberation Front, the OLF, the Tigrayan People's Liberation Front, the TPLF, and the now called Amhara National Democratic Movement, the ANDM. At the time, Abiy's town of Agaro was considered an OLF stronghold in which the group enjoyed majority support. Unfortunately, the political climate at the time was in dire straits, and Abiy's father, Ahmed Ali, along with his first son, Kedir Ahmed, were incarcerated for a period of time. While Abiy's father was released soon after, regrettably his brother Kedir was killed. It is believed that the loss of his brother shook Abiy Ahmed to his core, causing him to reevaluate the path his life was taking. Immediately after the death of his brother, just short of his 15th birthday, Abiy Ahmed took to the struggle. He fought as a child soldier in the last stages of the guerrilla uprising to overthrow Ethiopia's Soviet-backed Derg regime. Fighters from Tigray led the rebellion, and Abiy soon added Tigrinya to his linguistic armory. Being a speaker of Tigrinya in a security apparatus dominated by Tigrayans allowed him to advance his military career. When the fighting was over, the fiercest and most cohesive of the rebel groups, the TPLF, took charge of the governing coalition, the EPRDF, and led Ethiopia's politics for the next 27 years. The Tigrayans came from a region in the north that contains ancient sites of civilization, and they thought of themselves as the heirs of a profound historical lineage. But they were a relatively small group, making up just 6% of Ethiopia's population, and they were trying to retain control of a fractious country. Between 1991 and his death in 2012, the Tigrayan soldier-politician Meles Zenawi governed Ethiopia as an autocracy with the backing of a TPLF-dominated coalition. The Zenawi regime oversaw rapid development and increased the international prominence of Ethiopia. But at the same time, his government marginalized ethnic groups including the Oromo and Amhara to solidify government power. In an effort to reset the balance of power, the TPLF-led regime split Ethiopia into semi-autonomous regions encompassing the traditional territories of the main ethnic groups. The effect was to seed the future with ethnic problems, creating a system of 11 mini-states in near perpetual tension. And indeed, this is the current state of Ethiopia. With the downfall of the Derg, Abiy Ahmed took formal military training at the Asefa Brigade in western Wolega with a focus on radio communications and military intelligence. In 1995, he was sent to Rwanda on a peacekeeping mission. Rwanda at the time was reeling from a devastating genocide that saw the massacre of close to 1 million people. Abiy would spend the next few years as a peacekeeping officer for the United Nations force in Kigali, Rwanda. In 1998, soon after his return to Ethiopia, Abiy Ahmed was deployed to aid his country in the Ethiopia-Eritrea border war. In this war, Abiy was put in charge of an intelligence and communications unit whose mission was to observe, analyze, detect, and report positions of the Eritrean military. A stalemate followed the war with Eritrea, and in 2001, Abiy Ahmed received a bachelor's degree in computer engineering from a well-known private IT college in Addis Ababa while still serving in the army. Abiy Ahmed later attained the rank of lieutenant colonel before deciding in 2010 to leave the military and his post as deputy director of the Information Network Security Agency to become a politician. In 2010, Abiy Ahmed was elected to the House of People's Representatives as a member of the Oromo Democratic Party, formerly called the Oromo People's Democratic Organization, the OPDO, which was part of the EPRDF ruling coalition. He also earned a doctorate in 2017 from the Institute for Peace and Security Studies of Addis Ababa University. As his star was rising, Abiy was appointed Minister of Science and Technology in the federal government in 2016, but he held the post for only a short while, leaving in October of that year to serve as a vice president of the Oromia regional government. Within his OPDO party, Abiy was elected head of the secretariat in 2017. By his own account, he was already agitating from the inside. For example, he was quoted saying, "I was always telling former prime ministers that I was going to replace them. You know, they can kill you for that, but I said it." Meanwhile, in 2012, Hailemarian Desalegn, a non-Tigrayan, became Prime Minister of Ethiopia. But the Tigrayans still held key positions in the government, the armed forces, and the state-controlled economy. For many Ethiopians, it was intolerable that Tigrayans, who make up about 6% of the populations, should wield so much power. There was particular discontent among the Oromo, the country's largest group, who felt that they were being marginalized. A contentious plan led by the EPRDF-led federal government to enlarge Ethiopia's capital Addis Ababa by linking the city to parts of the Oromia region was met with protests by the Oromo people in 2015. As the government pushed to expand the capital city into surrounding Oromo villages, many people complained that their land had been seized without compensation. Protests broke out and the unrest spread to other regions. The next year saw more protests, now fueled by a broader array of grievances against the government occurring in Oromia as well as in other regions. Tensions boiled over in 2018 after years of protests in which thousands were killed. That year, Prime Minister Hailemarian Desalegn stepped down, calling for reforms that would lead to sustainable peace and democracy. His departure gave Abiy Ahmed his opening. When the position of Prime Minister opened up, Abiy's candidacy offered a new vision for the country, that is, shrinking the Ethiopian state to allow greater freedom and a more democratic system. On April 2, 2018, the House of People's Representatives elected him Prime Minister and he was sworn in on the same day.
To Ethiopia now, where the new Prime Minister, Dr. Abiy Ahmed, has been sworn in. Abiy took the oath of office in a ceremony at the House of People's Representatives in Addis Ababa. He faces the challenge of implementing reforms pledged by the government. He must also bridge differences that have erupted within the ruling coalition. He becomes the first ethnic Oromo to be Prime Minister. The country coalition council voted him earlier last week to replace Hailemarian Desalegn. Hailemarian resigned from his post in mid-February to clear the way for reforms. Ahmed takes office at the time.
During his inaugural address to Parliament in 2018, Abiy Ahmed made a point of thanking his mother, a Christian from the Amhara region, who he said had told him at the age of 7 that, despite his modest background, he would one day become the 7th king of Ethiopia. This particular remark was met with a round of laughter from his cabinet members, but Abiy Ahmed's belief in his mother's prophecy was no joke. Anyways, the new Prime Minister had a youthful energy and a beaming smile that offered hope. Within days of coming to power, Abiy moved to overturn the status quo. He began by releasing thousands of political prisoners and decried the use of torture in Ethiopia's prisons. He also ended a state of emergency imposed by the TPLF and launched an overhaul of the country's security agencies. In those early optimistic days of Abiy's premiership, he kick-started a flurry of ambitious reforms, including appointing women to positions in his cabinet and opening up the country's tightly controlled economy to new investment. The Prime Minister traveled across Ethiopia projecting youthful exuberance. His approachability contrasted with the fear-inducing distance of his predecessors, and for many ordinary citizens he met on his frequent trips, he was nothing like any recent leader they knew. Yet even at the height of Abiy mania, some people warned that he had character flaws. One acquaintance said that ever since his mother's prophecy, Abiy had possessed a messianic quality. Being a devout member of the Pentecostal church, he consulted God but rarely heeded earthly counsel. At the same time, Abiy Ahmed prized his physical strength, boasting of having seen off an attempted coup by impressing soldiers with his push-ups.
Prime Minister Abiy Ahmed challenged dozens of his country's disgruntled elite soldiers to 10 press-ups for storming his office with weapons. These soldiers had marched to Abiy's office in Addis Ababa to demand a pay raise. The troops belonged to units deployed last month to repress violence on the streets of Addis Ababa. Abiy's chief of staff, Fitso Marega, later indicated that he listened carefully to the servicemen's claims but reprimanded them for the poor procedure used to express them.
Abiy Ahmed's crowning achievement was the peace deal with Eritrea and the reopening of the common border. For 2 decades, Ethiopia had been in a hostile standoff with its neighbor Eritrea, the lingering after effect of the border war that claimed as many as 100,000 lives. On June 5, 2018, Abiy Ahmed announced that Ethiopia would adhere to the terms of the 2000 peace agreement that had been intended to end the border war with Eritrea that had begun in 1998. This included accepting and implementing the 2002 ruling that demarcated the border between the two countries, which Ethiopia had previously rejected. The next month he went to Eritrea to meet with that country's president, Isaias Afwerki. The two leaders agreed to re-establish ties between their countries in the areas of diplomacy, trade, communications and transportation, as well as to reopen their borders. This was followed by a momentous joint statement from Abiy Ahmed and Isaias Afwerki on July 9, declaring that the state of war that had existed between their two countries for 20 years had come to an end. These efforts led to Abiy Ahmed being the recipient of the Nobel Prize for Peace for his efforts to resolve Ethiopia's border conflict with Eritrea.
I now call upon the Nobel Peace Prize laureate of 2019 to come forward and give his Nobel lecture. Prime Minister.
Thank you. I am committed to toil for peace every single day and in all seasons. I am my brother's keeper. I am my sister's keeper too. I have promises to keep before I sleep. I have miles to go on the road of peace. As I conclude, I call upon the international community to join me and my fellow Ethiopians in our Madamar-inspired efforts of building enduring peace and prosperity in the Horn of Africa. Salam ለሁላችን ነገኝ ሁንደ ኬኛ ፈተው. Peace shall be upon all of us. Thank you very much.
However, Abiy's critics said that what cemented his status as a peacemaker on the world stage was based on a farce, and that the alignment with Eritrea was yet another effort to consolidate his power, paving the way for the two sides to wage war against their mutual enemy, the TPLF. At first glance, Abiy Ahmed's background made him almost perfectly positioned to bridge the country's ethnic and religious divides. Although his overtures and reform efforts were welcomed and applauded by many, not everyone in Ethiopia was ready to accept such change, which allowed simmering ethnic tensions to be brought to the fore. Meanwhile, Abiy Ahmed carried on with his reforms and increasingly worked to force TPLF members out of his administration. His move in November 2019 to disband the EPRDF and form a new unified political organization, the Prosperity Party, intensified his struggle with the TPLF. Sensing a reduction in its power, the TPLF refused to join Abiy's new organization. Its leadership decamped to northern Ethiopia, and in Tigray's regional capital of Mekelle, the TPLF became an alternate center of power, with much of the country's bureaucratic expertise and a significant portion of its military force. The situation soon came to a head when in 2020, Prime Minister Abiy Ahmed postponed the scheduled national elections, saying that COVID-19 presented too great of a threat. In spite of the official postponement, the Tigrayan officials held elections in the Tigray region in September 2020. In these elections, the TPLF received 98% of the vote, giving its chairman Debretsion Gebremichael control of the regional congress. In response, Abiy Ahmed's federal government began withholding funds from the region the following month. These simmering tensions would soon erupt into combat in early November 2020. The war began with what the TPLF described as both a preemptive operation and a legitimate act of self-defense against forces that Abiy Ahmed had mobilized around the region. Before daybreak on November 4, 2020, Tigrayan soldiers attacked a key Ethiopian army garrison near Mekelle. Within hours of the attack, Abiy Ahmed's warplanes and army units were on their way to counter the attack and to seize Mekelle.
Prime Minister Abiy Ahmed has ordered a military response. My dear people, today the apostate Ethiopian has stabbed Ethiopia. What makes this attack one of the most shocking attacks is that Tigray People's Liberation Front is viewing the Ethiopian National Defense Forces as a foreign army rather than an army that has been protecting the people of Tigray for more than 20 years.
Later that month, federal troops captured Tigray's capital, Mekelle, and Abiy Ahmed declared victory in spite of the fact that skirmishes continued. The chairman of the TPLF, Debretsion, and his comrades had vanished into the Tigrayan countryside.
The federal government had every right to deploy federal security forces and use force in order to apprehend those implicated in massive corruption and gross human rights violation.
In this war in Tigray, Abiy Ahmed had not fought by himself, as his Ethiopian National Defense Force weren't strong enough. To take on the militarily strong TPLF, Abiy Ahmed had formed a military alliance with Eritrea, which has a powerful army and one of the world's most repressive governments. The Prime Minister had also solicited support from Amhara militias. In this particular case, both the Eritreans and the Amhara had old grievances with the TPLF. As the war continued, however, both the Eritrean and Ethiopian officials initially denied that Eritrean troops were involved in the conflict. A communications blackout implemented at the outset of the conflict blocked coverage of ground conditions, but very soon the media and United Nations officials began sounding the alarm about improper treatment of civilians, especially ethnic Tigrayans, by December 2020. Reports spread of gang rapes and of widespread killings of civilians. Abiy's government denied the charge, but videos were circulating that appeared to show persuasive evidence of war crimes. Finally, in March 2021, Prime Minister Abiy Ahmed acknowledged that the Eritreans had been involved in the fighting and also acknowledged that atrocities may have been committed. The Prime Minister also promised somewhat vaguely to seek justice. By mid-2021, the tide had turned in this regional conflict, with Tigrayan forces going on the offensive and launching attacks on their advance towards Mekelle. The Tigrayan forces would recapture Mekelle on 28 June 2021. Also during this time, the postponed general elections were held in June 2021. A month later, Addis Ababa announced the results of the elections, with Abiy Ahmed winning a landslide. However, the TPLF boycotted these elections, and opposition leadership in parliament accused the Abiy regime of banning electoral observers in some states. Later, in the summer of 2021, Abiy Ahmed called on all capable citizens to join the war against Tigrayan forces as the conflict began to spill over into the Afar and Amhara regions, growing closer to Addis Ababa. In November 2021, Tigrayan troops and allied Oromo militants marched within 85 miles of the capital but were forced back north by the Ethiopian National Defense Forces. After a series of failed efforts to negotiate a settlement, the TPLF and the Ethiopian federal government signed a cessation of hostilities agreement on November 2, 2022 in Pretoria, South Africa. By the time the Pretoria Agreement took effect, the Tigray War and its associated humanitarian disaster had killed approximately 600,000 people. Exacerbating this is the fact that famine seems to be stalking parts of Ethiopia, with the epicenter being the northern Tigray region. The conflict in Tigray contributed to and coincided with worsening conditions throughout Ethiopia. Early in the war, the government declared a state of emergency in Amhara state after a series of violent attacks against ethnic Oromo residents. Oromia's regional army had allied itself with the Tigrayans in the civil war, whereas militants from the Amhara and Afar regions were accused of assisting federal troops, even attacking civilians they suspected to be Tigrayan or affiliated with the TPLF. Even though the Amhara militias had fought alongside federal troops in the Tigray war, very soon that alliance collapsed when the federal government and Tigrayan leaders reached a deal that ended the conflict. At the same time, in May 2022, Ethiopia arrested over 4,000 people in Amhara to weaken the nationalist militia that had helped the government repel the TPLF, fearing that its growing power could challenge the state. The next month in June 2022, government forces were accused of neglecting to respond to the killing of hundreds of Amhara people in Oromia. Almost a year later, in April 2023, the central government announced that all regional security forces permitted to operate under the national constitution would be integrated into the national security services.
Protesters in cities and towns across Ethiopia's Amhara region have rallied in support of their local forces for 5 days in a row. They want the federal government to abandon its plans to integrate their regional fighters into the national military or police.
Well, this decision was largely seen as an attempt to degrade the autonomy of the regions, and it sparked violent protests and militia activity in Amhara and elsewhere.
Ethiopia's military has pushed out local militiamen out of the Amhara region, a breakthrough since fighting erupted last week. Witnesses say government troops gained control of Gondar, Amhara's second biggest city, and entered the town of Lalibela. The two towns were overrun last week by Fano militia, a serious security crisis since the 2-year Tigray conflict ended last November. The government is yet to comment on the matter, despite imposing a curfew in Gondar, Lalibela, and 4 other areas until the 23rd of August.
Earlier this year, on February 2, Ethiopia's Parliament's House of People's Representatives extended the state of emergency in Amhara by 4 months. As for Oromia, local militants began a string of attacks on ethnically Amhara enclaves in the region in early March 2021, and waves of Amhara began to flee Oromia. The Oromo have long faced political marginalization in Ethiopia despite their status as the largest ethnic group in the country. The Oromo Liberation Army, the OLA, which claims to fight for the right to self-determination of the Oromo, has attacked and dismantled the government administration in these zones where kidnapping for ransom has become commonplace.
In the deserts that straddle Ethiopia and Kenya, hundreds of fighters are preparing for a hidden war. These are men and women of the Oromo Liberation Army. The OLA says its people, the Oromo, have been oppressed for more than a century. This is an old armed struggle, but many of the people here that you can see were not born when the Oromo Liberation Army was first formed in the 1970s. Today, as Ethiopia faces many conflicts and challenges, this group sees new opportunities.
Toward the end of the Tigray war, violence in Oromia once again flared up with a particularly deadly attack on an Amhara enclave which left approximately 200 people dead in June 2022. Prime Minister Abiy Ahmed, who was born in Oromia, condemned the OLA for the killings, while other elements within the federal government pointed to evidence that regional leadership was involved. In April 2023, Ethiopia began peace talks with the OLA in Tanzania. One obstacle for these peace talks, however, has been the disorganized nature of the OLA, which lacks a clear chain of command. A third attempt to negotiate ended abruptly in November 2023, with the government citing the OLA's obstruction and unrealistic demands, and the OLA citing the government's failure to address fundamental issues underlying national unrest. Wars in Ethiopia can take shocking tolls and cause immense civilian suffering, and this tangle of crises is corroding inter-ethnic relations and posing threats to Ethiopia's stability.
Ethiopia will not collapse. Ethiopia will prosper. Ethiopia will exist forever honorably by defeating all who test her through the blood and bones of her children.
Subsequent events in Ethiopia have also led to the tarnishing of Abiy Ahmed's image around the world. Also, his critics accuse his government of being an authoritarian regime. Thank you all for tuning in. This has been Tatenda for African Biographics. Until next time, cheers. Have a good one.